Liberal Senator James Paterson. Thanks for joining us, James. First time we've catch up since the election. You must be feeling pleased to be still in government.
Oh, absolutely pleased, Chris, but I have to say just overwhelmingly the sense is one of relief, not for ourselves, but on behalf of all those people that walked out on polling booths, having cast their vote, and came up to me quietly and said, please tell me you were going to win. Please tell me Bill Shorten is not going to be Prime Minister because I just can't afford it. Whether they're a small business person, a retiree, a worker, they just were terrified about the prospect of Bill Shorten's Prime Ministership. So on their behalf, I'm feeling quite relieved.
Well, you're a man who speaks a lot about liberty, personal liberty, and the role of freedom in our society. Are you concerned at all about these AFP raids, one yesterday on News Corp journalist Anika Smethurst's house and today at the ABC headquarters?
Chris, I completely understand why news organisations and why journalists are uncomfortable being on the receiving end of a police raid. That would be a very difficult thing to go through personally, and I understand why they're troubled by that. At the same, and I want to also say that press freedom is just about one of the most important freedoms that we have in a free society, and it must be upheld. I want to say at the same time, though, Chris, that we are a country of the rule of law, and the AFP is operating independently and with court warrants in order to conduct these raids. I've seen some commentary in the press suggesting that this is some attempt by the government to shut down its critics or to shut down reporting. I mean, the police in Australia are not directed by politicians. We don't tell them what to do and what not to do. This is not a third world country where politicians direct the police, and police cannot do anything without receiving a warrant from a court. So I think those things are important to bear in mind.
Yeah, and I pointed out earlier the hypocrisy here where many journalists cheered on the breaking of confidences to reveal a leak out of Michaelia Cash's office in 2017 and pursuing vengeance and even the job of one of her staffers, pursuing the minister, yet crying foul about these investigations. I too support press freedom, but I do think it's a complex area when we talk about whistleblowers, laws and all the rest of it, but in the end, when journalists accept national security leaks, it's a good thing to do in the public interest, but it's beholden upon them to expect there's going to be an investigation and make sure that there's no evidence around that's going to betray their sources.
I think that's a fair point, Chris, and I think the other thing I would add to that is that the unauthorised disclosure of confidential information can be a crime, and it is a crime for a very good reason. We place a lot of trust and authority in the hands of a relatively small number of public servants in particular who have access to really privileged, confidential, private information that for good reason we don't want out in public. And if that does find its way into the public, and if we were not to investigate that, what kind of message would that send to the public service about the importance of the confidentiality obligations that they voluntarily and willingly entered into when they took out their positions? Now, that's not a comment specifically on these cases, but it's just a comment generally about applying the rule of law and ensuring that the confidentiality, where it's necessary, is protected.
Now, James, you talked about the relief of holding on to government, the relief that the country was spared Labor's high taxing, high spending agenda, yet the National Accounts figures out today, and indeed the action of the Reserve Bank yesterday in lowering interest rates, speaks to the fragility of our national economy. It speaks to the lack of economic growth. How concerned are you about this, both as an indictment of the Coalition's economic policy up to this point and as a challenge right now in the first days of the new Morrison government to actually get some economic activity, some growth, some investment happening in this country?
Well, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, in particular over the last year, have been really clear about one thing, Chris, which is that we've got a great track record in recent years, particularly the over 1 million jobs that have been created, but that we also do face at the same time some serious economic headwinds. Now, some of those economic headwinds are global. We are gravely concerned, as the Prime Minister's repeated again today in London, about the possibility of an escalating trade war between China and the United States and the flow-on implications that will have in Australia. But we've also seen some instances of domestic economic weakness, and the housing market in particular has been a cause for some concern for households and for the government. So we've been very upfront and honest to say that while we've had some great results in recent years, we can't take those for granted, and it's very important that we put a very high premium on a strong economic performance going forward. I think the most important thing that we can do as a government is something that we're already planning to do in the July sittings when the Parliament returns, and that's the personal income tax cuts reform that we will be legislating. That returns money back into the hands of those who earns it, that gives them that incentive to work harder, to invest and to take risks, and that also gives them more money to spend in the economy at a time when the economy may need it.
Now, of course, we've seen Scott Morrison reveal his new ministry. There's been a lot of refresh in the ministry, of course, with a lot of retirements at the election. You will have been disappointed that you didn't get a junior spot. I think Tim Wilson's another who might have been disappointed, a Victorian Lower House MP. Others, up-and-comers, I think, like Nicole Flint, Andrew Hastie, a number of talented people who might have expected a call-up who didn't. But as a small government person, James Paterson, are you disappointed that Scott Morrison named a front bench of 42, 30 ministers and a dozen assistant ministers? Isn't 42 on the front bench just too many, too big, and wasn't this a great opportunity to send a signal about smaller, leaner government and trim that number a bit?
Well, Chris, in politics there is always an unlimited number of aspirants for positions and a limited number of positions available to be handed out. And as you hinted at the second half of your question there, I think it's a very good thing that there's a limited number of positions to be handed out. We don't want to see the ever-growing growth of government. We don't want to see the ministry and the rest of the government expand remorselessly. The number of 42 that you referred to in the ministry has actually been pretty stable in recent years. It's certainly a lot larger than it was 30 or 40 years ago, but the economy and the country is much more complex, and government does much more than it once did, so it probably does need
Come on, there's more MPs to keep happy, you mean?
Well, no, the number of MPs has been relatively stable in recent years, but you're right, it's certainly increased back from 30 to 40 years ago. So I wouldn't want to see the ministry expand any more than it already is. I think it's certainly large enough already, and that is an important constraint on ambitious young backbenchers and others to accept that while the Prime Minister's got a really great team and a mix of talent and experience, not everyone can be on the front bench, and certainly they can't all be on the front bench at once, and that's just the reality of politics that I think we all need to accept.
Besides, anyone who's read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy knows that 42 is the answer to life, the universe and everything. Anyway, James Paterson, I want to catch up with you another time and talk about ABC bias, but we are out of time now. Thanks for joining us. Senator James Paterson there from Melbourne.